What's up? I'm Shane, and I want to ask you a question about something that I guess that you've experienced at some point. Have you ever played video games where you're automatically thrown onto a team with just like a bunch of random people you've never met? Maybe it's like Rocket League or I don't know, something like that. You're joined onto a team with randos, right? Like you have no idea or choice over who you join with. But here's what happens. They become your crew, your people. And just like your team was formed, the team that you're playing is all random too. It's just random people who came together to play this game. But just because you're on this team and they're on that team, they automatically become your enemies. Just simply because you're not on the same team, you're divided. Isn't that interesting how that works? Like, yeah, it happens in video games and I get it. It's not that deep. But the reality is that it happens in a lot more places than just video games. In fact, you can scroll through Instagram or TikTok for 5 minutes and you can see some sort of tension, strong opinions, or division between people. Or maybe you hear the adults in your home talk about certain things and you can just like feel the tension or those feelings of like awkwardness or maybe like a little bit of anger or just that tense feeling between them. Look, it's no secret that there are some topics that divide all types of people. It can drive a wedge between family members and best friends or even people of the same faith. This happens at the table during family gatherings, and it might even show up in your everyday life. Maybe you can't go to grandma's house unless you avoid certain topics, because if you bring them up, it's gonna get heated. Or maybe auntie so-and-so isn't invited because grandpa you-know-who will be there, and the last time that they were together, it was like Avengers Endgame and not like the cool scene where Black Panther shows up. I'm talking just a mess. Or maybe you've been forbidden from going to your friend's house because of what their parents believe. Look, there's probably a bunch of situations that you can think of where things get awkward because people just don't agree. But sometimes this gets extreme to the point where they stop talking or they can't talk without a fight breaking out. Maybe in those moments you felt confused. Maybe you wish everyone would just get along or at least not bring up the things that always lead to a fight. And I don't think it's any secret that this is really real, especially right now, because for too many reasons to get into, we know that politics, elections, and opinions about trending topics can bring out some really strong emotions in people, especially when those people disagree. And when that happens, most of us just feel kind of awkward. And we don't know what to do when the tensions, or again, that word tensions, what I mean is it's those feelings of awkwardness or anger or discomfort. When those feelings are high, we just don't know what to do. I mean, what exactly are we supposed to do when our families or people that we care about are divided, especially about something like politics or their opinions or trending topics? Sometimes when the people around us are so divided, it can cause us to wonder where God is in all of this, especially when the people who are fighting are Christians. Now, let me be clear, I'm not questioning anyone's faith, but I am wondering if this is what it's supposed to be like, especially for followers of Jesus. Now, unfortunately, tensions and divisions aren't anything new, but fortunately for us, the Bible is full of real stories that we can learn from. Stories of siblings who didn't talk to each other for years, or religious and social groups who looked down on other people, even stories of cultural groups who hated one another and avoided each other at all cost. Jesus actually lived during a time of constant political, social, and religious tensions and divisions. A long time ago, one of those divisions was between two groups of people, Jews and Samaritans. And 2,000 years ago, it was understood that Jews did not talk to or interact with Samaritans. But then, one day, Jesus was going through Samaria, which is where Samaritans lived. I want you to imagine this. It was midday, the sun was up high in the sky, it was hot. And Jesus and his disciples had been walking all day. So the disciples went into town to find food, and Jesus sat down by the well so he could get some water. And then a Samaritan woman came to get water, and Jesus asked her for a drink of water. Now, asking for a cup of water may not seem like a big deal to you or to me, but the Samaritan woman was surprised. In fact, the disciple John, who was one of Jesus' closest friends and followers, actually wrote something down about the interaction between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Just then, his disciples came back. They were shocked to find him talking to a woman, but none of them had the nerve to ask, "What do you want with her?" or "Why are you talking to her?" Okay, so They were all wondering this because Jews didn't necessarily talk to Samaritans. And in their culture, even though I know this seems wild to us today, at that time, men didn't randomly talk to women, especially in like a conversation like this. It just wasn't a normal situation. But this is what's key. Jesus cared more about the Samaritan woman than he did about the politics and the social barriers of the time. The conversation that Jesus wanted to have with her was more important than the divisions of the day. See, Jesus in this conversation would go on to say some really encouraging things. And eventually, what we see is that this woman's life would be impacted for the better. And eventually, she would tell her whole village of people about Jesus. Jesus shows us how to love people even when there's tension. That's what happens in this story. And here's the reality. The tensions in our world, they're not gonna go away. We can't change how other people act or what they will say or do. We can't change the fact that people we love will argue or fight about things, even if it winds up hurting their relationships with other people. And we can't change that people will have different opinions, values, and thoughts about, well, basically everything. And honestly, we can't change how the adults in our lives behave toward each other. So what do? If we can't do anything, are we just helpless? Thankfully, no. We aren't helpless. In fact, one of the most influential Christians in history, this guy named Paul, he actually told us something that we can do. Paul grew up in that same society where social and religious divisions were normal, specifically between Jewish people and non-Jewish people who were known as Gentiles. In fact, Paul lived in the middle of that division. Paul was a Jew called to share the good news of Jesus with the Gentiles or the non-Jewish people. See, basically, he was supposed to talk about Jesus with people that he didn't have a whole lot in common with. So if there's anyone who could potentially help us handle tensions and disagreements, maybe it would be someone who experienced them in the ways that Paul did. And here's something that he wrote that could actually help us when it comes to tensions in relationships. Check this out. My brothers and sisters, you were chosen to be free, but don't use your freedom as an excuse to live under the power of sin. Instead, serve one another in love. The whole law is fulfilled by obeying this one command. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. If you say or do things that harm one another, watch out. You could end up destroying one another. Okay, this is pretty intense, but Paul saw the tensions of his day and he called them out. Remember, he just said this: if you say or do things that harm one another, watch out. You could end up destroying one another. Okay, when you hear this, maybe somebody comes to mind. Like, you can think of somebody who's like fighting or in this type of tension. And look, we don't need to say who, but for some of us, that word picture that he uses, maybe it brought up some experiences that we'd rather not repeat. Isn't it true that those tensions and divisions that Paul talked about still exist today? But here's what's cool. Paul also said that we have received the gift of freedom in Jesus. But Paul warned us not to use that freedom to satisfy our selfishness or just what we want or we think is best for only ourselves. Because the reality is that is really easy to do. I mean, if I can say what I want, what's stopping me from saying whatever I want to whoever I want, however I want to say it? Because, I mean, eventually, like, Jesus forgives me, right? Everything will be okay. Well, yeah, I mean, nothing's technically stopping us. Jesus always loves us and is always willing to forgive us. That's the gift of freedom. But Paul strongly suggests that we should use that freedom we have not necessarily to do things just the way that we want to, but that we should use our freedom to serve one another. Paul reminded us of one of the things Jesus said was more important than anything else in life. Love your neighbor as yourself. See, when we choose to serve and love people around us, we're actually living like Jesus. We're living out what Jesus said matters most. Our relationships, they win. Now, I'm not saying that everything is going to be perfect all of a sudden, but when we choose to love the person in front of us, then we're choosing to act how Jesus would in that situation. Here's the thing. You aren't too young to set that example, even for the adults in your life who seem divided and at odds or just in tension with each other. So when you find yourself in a situation where there's lots of tension and disagreements, this is what I want you to remember. Jesus shows us how to love people even when there is tension. You may not be able to change what adults in the world around you say and do, but you can change what you say and do. You can choose to be more like Jesus. You can choose to love your parents, grandparents, coaches, teachers, and leaders, even if there's tension at times between the adults in the world around you. You can choose to serve one another in love. You can choose to prioritize people over personal opinions. You can choose to maintain friendships even when you disagree. So instead of getting frustrated, upset, or disappointed with how the adults in your life or people around you are acting, a better way to approach it is to ask this question: how can I be like Jesus in the middle of the tension? Here's an idea of where we can start. Care more about the person in front of you than the tension going on around you. It's easy to focus on the cause of the tension around you, but the way of Jesus is choosing people first. That means that we're prioritizing people the most. And this isn't always easy to do. Being loving to people who you totally disagree with, or people who are on the complete other side of an argument, can be difficult. But I believe that when you do this, it can leave a lasting positive impact on the people that you're being loving to. You may be wondering what it looks like to be loving to people who are in the middle of tensions. Well, loving someone may look like listening to them. Loving someone could mean asking questions without feeling the need to give all the answers. Loving someone might look like finding something else that you love about them and choosing to focus on that instead of just focusing on their opinions or arguments. Being loving might mean changing the subject so that you don't get too frustrated or annoyed. Being loving can always mean asking God to help you love them when you don't know how to. Remember, Jesus shows us how to love people even when there is tension. Jesus showed us a bunch of examples of how to love all sorts of different people. Maybe loving someone just means focusing on who's in front of you and asking God to show you how to love them in that moment. Tensions and divisions are a part of our lives. People can give into these tensions and become divided, even about things that don't really seem to be that deep. They don't matter that much, right? But Imagine if you didn't have to feel totally helpless or confused when you're in a situation like that. Imagine if you could choose to follow Jesus' example and love people even when they disagree. This is the kind of approach that over time could change the world. And I believe that your generation can be the one that starts to get this right. Jesus shows us how to love people even when there's tension. When you go to groups, think about your answer to this question. Who are the people in your life that you can be loving to even when they disagree?